Hello and welcome to a special webcast we're going to do today to talk about Hayden Fry and remember his career at the University of Iowa as football coach and a real icon in Iowa sports history, I guess we can talk about. My name is J.R. Ogden. I'm sports editor of the Gazette. I am joined on my right by Mark Dukes, former sports editor of the Gazette, and now a radio host with KGYM, and Jim Ecker to my left, who covered Iowa for a good 10 years, I believe. He was on the beat the last 10 years of Hayden Fry's career. And Jim is on KMRY radio as well, so you can listen to these guys beyond this. I'm sure they'll be talking about this for at least a couple of days, probably week or more to come. So, one of the things we've talked about, but off camera, I guess, is just the impact that Hayden Fry had on Iowa football. I mean, that's kind of the biggest thing I think that's kind of come up in this. Mark, you said you started covering him in '81?
Full-time in 1981, and, at the time, Iowa was in the throes of multiple losing seasons, and Hayden took over in 1979. I covered a couple games in 79 and 80, but 81 was my first year on the beat, and was fortunate enough to be on the beat through most of the 80s until Jim took over. And you're right, JR. Hayden Fry simply changed the culture of Iowa football in so many ways. It wasn't just on the field. It was his dabbling into marketing, changing uniforms, and right on down the line throughout, much of his career. And that's all well and good, but the culture doesn't change unless you win. And in 1981, the winning began, and essentially didn't stop except for a couple bumps along the road.
And Jim, you took over. When did you take over, and what are your kind of remembrances at that time?
Yeah, I took over in time for the 1989 season, just in time for them to have a losing season. Thanks a lot, Dukesy. Appreciate that. Well, Hayden Fry, I was watching the Big Ten Network last night, the tribute to Hayden and the Hawkeyes, and Hayden Fry was nothing less than an American original. His personality and his coaching ability, he was unique, truly in the sense of that word. If there was a Mount Rushmore in Iowa, he'd be on it. Yeah. I mean, he'd be up there with Kinnick, Gable, and unfortunately, the late, great Bump Elliott as well. To lose Bump and Hayden in the span of a couple of weeks, those two guys, the impact they've had, not only on the 20 years when Bump was the athletic director for 20 years and Hayden then was 20 years, it wasn't simultaneous, but what Bump and Hayden brought about and passed it on to Kirk Ferentz, it's 40 years. Yeah. 40 years of two coaches and a terrific run, as Mark said, a couple of down years, but for the most part, over those 40 years, it's just been phenomenal.
The thing about that relationship with Bump Elliott, this is Bump's third hire as head coach. If you recall, he hired Frank Lauterbur, famous for losing or non-winning seasons, and then Bob Cummings, who had a spot of success here and there, but eventually he went away, and this is a big hire for Bump Elliott. I'm not sure. Of course, he hired Gable and Tom Davis and many others, and was very successful in that regard. But this is a big hire for Bump, and he took a chance on a guy who had never seen Iowa before, a guy who brought a Texas accent with him that few of us understood for a while,
and sense of humor,
his wit, his phrases. He could turn a phrase. Sometimes I thought he was full of it, but that's beside the point. My point is that it was a big hire for Bump Elliott, and it turned out well for both of them.
I think, I'm glad you guys mentioned Bump. I think we'd be remiss not to. He passed away a couple weeks ago, and was also a big, icon that just the people he hired. I think, as I recall, at the time of he hired Fry, he said, "This will be the last football coach I hire, because if it doesn't work, I'm gone." So I think he did have a big impact on that as well. What do you think they saw? What do you think Bump Elliott and saw in Fry?
Well, Bump did his research, and Mark would know better because he was here at the time, and I was not. But Bump didn't just pick Hayden Fry's name out of a hat. Bump had a family. His brother Pete was the athletic director at Miami, I believe, and knew Hayden personally. And Bump, of course, was well connected in the college football world, and he knew what Hayden had gone through at SMU and the boosters trying to convince Hayden, hey, take our money and buy some players, and Hayden said no, and that's why he lost his job at SMU. And then the terrific job he did at North Texas State. I think 9-2 was last year, but no bowl game, and that was one of the impetuses for Hayden. Gee, if I go 9-2 and I can't get into a bowl game, of course things are now different. 9-2 now, they'd be knocking on your door, but 40 years ago it was much different. And so they did their research, and as Mark said, Hayden had never been to Iowa and didn't know Iowans, but Iowans didn't know Hayden either. I mean, it was quite a culture shock at first, and what a great story it turned out to be.
Well, I think part of it was his innovation on offense. He was passing the ball and doing different formations. I'm not sure he did the stand-up tight end at North Texas, but he eventually brought that to Iowa, which was unique, and he put the ball in the air. And I whether that was something Bump was attracted to, but you have to have a fit. When you hire somebody, as you know, JR, Jim, you have to have a fit. You have to have a relationship and something you think that will last. And obviously, Bump felt that.
And Bump told Hayden as well. He assured him that you'll get all the resources, all the support you need, because Hayden had gone through some rough times at SMU where he wasn't really the boss. At North Texas State, he was the athletic director as well. And when Bump assured Hayden, you'll have the money, you'll have the coaches you want, you'll have promised him the indoor facility, and this and that, I think that was one of the selling points for Hayden. Hey, it's a program that's been down. I've got a great athletic director who was a Big Ten football coach himself. He's given me a rock-solid guarantee that he'll do everything in his power to help me succeed. I think that was very attractive to Hayden.
You mentioned that he came in here and he was promised a lot. I think that was part of the Bump Elliott story too. That Bump did kind of say, "This is your program." And Hayden, I think, mentioned the fact too that he liked working for an ex-football coach as well.
Sure.
What do you think he did that finally made this click?
For one thing, I think he had a keen eye for talent, both in coaches and in players. You look at some of the former coaches that Hayden Fry, you guys know who they are, Alvarez and Bill Snyder and McCarney and Kirk Ferentz and Donnie Patterson at the FCS level, and right on down, Bob Stoops, right on down the line. So he often said he didn't want to hire an assistant coach who didn't aspire to be a head coach. And I think that was really big. And he kept the staff together by and large. And what I mean by a keen eye for talent, take Barry Alvarez, for example, who was just won a state championship at Mason City High School. And he's going to bring him in. He brought in Kirk Ferentz as a 25 or 6-year-old graduate assistant. And I remember when he was hired, people said, "Oh, who's this guy?" Well, the rest is history in terms of Kirk. And then players, he was successful with Bernie Wyatt's help out in New Jersey. Got a lot of great players out in New York and New Jersey, Ronnie Harmon and Kevin Harmon and whatnot, and Ohio for sure. But then he was able to pluck a guy like Chuck Long out of Wheaton, Illinois, who had very few, if any, college offers. And Chuck's freshman year, Fry made the outlandish statement, "This guy's destined for greatness." And we're all saying, "Really?"
A kid from Wheaton, Illinois?
Well, he was.
Yeah.
Chuck Long was on the Big Ten Network last night by phone, not in the studio, and Chuck was telling some of those stories and how Iowa was really the only major school that offered him a scholarship. But then when Iowa offered, some other D1s came on thinking, well, if he's good enough for Iowa, he's probably good enough for us, although Chuck did not mention specifically the schools. But Chuck told an interesting story. His freshman year at Iowa, did you see this last night?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so it's his freshman year at Iowa. He's, like the scout team quarterback or something. He's not the varsity starter at that point. And apparently, the way Chuck tells it, he had a good scrimmage. He had a good practice. And just getting the team ready for the next game. Hayden goes back to his office and writes a handwritten note to Chuck's parents, mails a note to Chuck Long's parents back in Wheaton, Illinois. Hey, Chuck's doing great. He had a great scrimmage, today. Really looking forward to great things out of the young man. And how many head coaches would do that? And so, we saw Hayden, the performer, at press conferences and, challenging Hunter Rawlings, the Iowa president who wanted to make freshmen ineligible. But we really didn't see a whole lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff. So here's Hayden Fry. Maybe his secretary wrote it. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's a Hayden Fry story. The truth doesn't matter.
It's funny you mentioned that because I was talked to Bill Happel today, and I was telling him a story that was related from Lou Montgomery earlier this morning, and I said, the thing is, you don't know. It sounds fantastic, like it might be true, and I go, I don't know if it's a Hayden story or if it's a Lou story. He goes, well, if it's a Hayden story, they all were fantastic, and you never knew if they were true or not. He did like doing it. But what did you see in him that you think made him so successful?
He was such a dominating personality. When you invited Mark and I to appear on the podcast today, I was just thinking about Hayden's eyes. I like to watch a lot of old westerns. I've been watching a lot of John Wayne movies. I see a lot of Jimmy Stewart movies, Robert Mitchum. Hayden had these captivating eyes that, and he would really capture your attention. And he had the psychology degree. A lot of people have made note of that over the years. But he was a master performer. I went to a lot of the eye clubs, when I was covering the Hawkeyes, either the banquets or the Friday morning breakfast before a home game. And, that audience would just, eat out of the palm of his hand. And other people have noted, you were saying upstairs before we came down, a great memory for names. People he hadn't seen in 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago. He'd walk in and he'd walk right up. He'd walk right up and embrace him and capture him. Kind of like LBJ. When LBJ was president, they talk about how LBJ would lean into you, know. He was just bigger than life. And he was really a magnetic personality. And of course, his football knowledge was superb as far as that goes. And, talking about him being a performer, and Mark knows, nobody enjoyed Hayden Fry's jokes more than Hayden Fry. and when the boss is up there laughing, and you're trying to be there, you're taking notes, you got some stories to write, and if Hayden's laughing, and then Gus Schrader would be laughing, and Zabel, and Gonder, and Brooksy, the old timers who had been there forever, and it was just different. It was a performance more so than anything else, I thought.
It's a good point. I want to back up a little bit because you had mentioned about his, the handwritten note. Because I mean, we had this conversation 30 years ago, 40 years ago when he was coaching. Because there was always this: who was the players' coach? I think at the time, Lute Olson had this reputation as that the players love him. But then someone said, no, people don't understand. Hayden Fry is a players' coach. The players will do anything for him because football. You got 100 players out there, and you got all these coaches. You don't see those relationships, those personal relationships sometimes. But it sounds like, he was very involved with these players.
He was, and he had a way of galvanizing the fan base to, number one, fit his own personal narrative, and number two, to deflect attention from the team often enough. And Jim and I both had our respective run-ins.
We're going to talk about that too.
Right. And but he was during the peak of his career in the 80s and then in the 90s. You take a poll in support of Hayden Fry, it's going to be damn near 100%.
Yeah.
and you don't see that everywhere, especially these days.
Right. I mean, I think the head coaches
that came with winning.
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. I think Mike wrote about it all comes with winning, but you don't see that today as much. It seems like more of a CEO instead of a personal coach sometimes. But I think he was very involved with those players.
Well, back then, in an earlier era in the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe into the 90s, head coaches in football and basketball were larger than life personalities. In the Big Ten, of course, there was Woody and Bo, and then Hayden came along to break up the Big Two and Little Eight. In basketball, my goodness, in the Big Ten, you had Bobby Knight and Johnny Orr and Gene Cady and Lou Henson and Judd Heathcote. You don't see that anymore. back then, those guys were making $200,000, $300,000. Now they're making $3 million, $4 million, $5 million. They've all got agents and advisors. Kirk Ferentz is a fabulous coach, but I don't think he's beloved like Hayden was. He's respected, he's admired. I'm not sure he's beloved. Hayden just had that knack, that connection to players and his assistant coaches. I mean, as Mark was saying before, throughout the 1980s, they pretty much all stuck together. Then a few started to branch off. Barry Alvarez went to be the defensive coordinator at Notre Dame, and then Dan McCarney went to work for Alvarez up at Wisconsin, and other people. Bill Snyder went to have a great career at Kansas State. But for the most part of the heyday, when Iowa turned it around in that 1981 season, toward the end of the 80s, that was remarkable.
Yeah.
That Hall of Fame staff stayed together so long.
Guys like Carl Jackson, I think he had a spot in the NFL, a stint in the NFL, and I mentioned Bernie Wyatt and Bobby Elliott for a while. The list goes on.
Yeah, it's a lot of great assistant coaches. Okay, you mentioned we're going to talk about it. You mentioned, Hayden was a master at deflecting it. I guess the way Mike wrote it, and this I remember this, he was a master at deflecting attention. If he didn't want you focusing on his team or his players, he would kind of come up with something to distract the media or distract the fans. And you guys both had little run-ins with him. I don't remember yours, but I remember yours pretty well. You got into a kind of an argument with him at a press conference, didn't you?
It wasn't an
tit
argument.
for tat.
I tried to offer a rebuttal to no effect. I got shut down. But it seems like a lot of times if Iowa was coming off a loss, or maybe they were trying to prepare for a particularly big game, and Hayden didn't want to talk about what went wrong the previous Saturday, and he didn't want to dwell on Michigan or Ohio State coming up. Mark Hansen at the Register was a foil more often than not. The one time he got me, it was just, and I'll go into the details if you want, but probably bore people to tears. But in the middle of a press conference, I asked him a question, and he turns to me and said, "Jimmy, you're a liar. You're a liar, Jimmy." I said, "What is this?" There was a misunderstanding. Wanted to get a story and a picture about their new winged uniforms. And I called Hayden, and Hayden said, "Well, it's okay with me. If it's okay with Greg Morris, our equipment manager." I called Greg Morris, said, "Morris, hey, Hayden says it's okay if it's okay with you." And then Morris went back to Hayden, and something got screwed up, and Hayden accused me of being a liar. I said, "No, sir, that's not true." But in any case, the spat was over within a couple of weeks.
I had to take a phone call the next day.
But it was it's that theme. He would do that. He would kind of pick times where he would do something like that just so he would change the story.
And it never affected our relationship, Hayden's relationship with me and me with him. We were fine. I could go up after the press conference and ask him any question you'd want. He didn't shut me out. I mean, you hear about reporters being shut out from. Never did that. It was my turn in the pickle jar, and I had to take it. We defended, Mark and I and others defended the Gazette as much as we needed to, but it was just our turn. You have to shrug and move forward.
What do you remember about those little tit for tats?
Well, it was 1988, and Iowa was in the throes of just an okay season. And the Hawkeyes faced Ohio State at Kinnick Stadium in the next to the last game. And Hayden Fry elected to settle for a tie. Iowa's third of the season, rather than go for a win against Ohio State. Iowa tied Michigan State, tied Michigan that year, and then now tied Ohio State. And as I and many reporters do, we go down to the field with like 5 minutes left in the game and follow Hayden off the field, which I did. I was from here to Jim, walking after him on the field, and I heard boos. And it wasn't 60,000 boos, but it was a significant number of boos. And I asked Hayden about it in the post-game news conference, and of course he said he didn't hear anything. And so I decided to write my Sunday column after that game, not only the fact that Iowa and Hayden decided to settle for a third tie of the season, but the reaction from fans and what I heard and what Hayden didn't. Well, the next Tuesday news conference, the trigger is pointed at me. And I don't remember everything that was said, but I do remember one of the local TV stations started off the 6 o'clock news. Not the sports part of it, the top of the 6 o'clock news with this spat that Hayden Fry had with me. And I thought I wrote fairly factual. You can look it up in the archives if you want. The next morning, I had a phone attached to my ear for most of the day. And the point about Fry being able to galvanize a fan base was never truer than those calls I got.
Yeah.
They were universally supportive of Hayden Fry despite the facts. Despite the facts. And the very last person I talked to that day was a woman who, said, how can you possibly challenge Hayden Fry and this and that? And her last comment was, and I'll never forget this, and she said, you know what, that picture of you in the paper, your nose looks like a beak of a duck. And that was the end of transmission.
They loved him, and they still do love him. And one of the things, everyone's got a Hayden Fry story to tell. I mean, an episode like some of these. But you guys have anything else? I mean, other fun stories that you remember?
Let me interject here first,
Okay.
And we'll go back to that. But to Jim's point, grudges weren't held. I remember the next week they're facing a game against Minnesota for a trip to the Peach Bowl, I think it was. And nothing ever happened. I'd ask him a question, and we'd visit afterwards, but he won the round. Yeah, he knew it. And of course, Iowa beat Minnesota that next week, and all was good.
Speaking of the Iowa-Minnesota game, of course, those of us who were there, and then there were still pictures, and then the TV people were there as well, up at Minnesota when Iowa beat Minnesota. And the Minnesota writer, I don't know if it was Sid Hartman or somebody, was making fun of the Hawkeyes or Iowans in general. And then Hayden comes out. It was not, they did not have a press conference room. Remember, it was in the hallway. Was that the Metrodome? I think it was the Metrodome.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he comes out wearing the bib overalls and the cowboy hat and
Flannel shirt, I think. And,
Yep. And he gave it back to Sid and the Minnesota writers pretty good. And as Mark said earlier, a lot of this stuff came after a victory, and he obviously planned for it. He packed for it, and he was ready. And it was just hysterical to see him pop out of the locker room and in that attire was classic. And of course, the funniest thing, maybe the silliest thing that captured everybody's attention was doing the hokey pokey.
Yeah.
Grown men, not just the players, and not just Hayden, but I have tried to have, I've never saw it in person, but to have a mental picture, of Bill Snyder or Carl Jackson doing the hokey pokey after a victory in the locker room, and it caught fire. The Kennedy Cougars do the hokey pokey in the locker room to this day.
And it's still a big thing at Fry Fest. I think they had, didn't they try to set a world record a few years ago or something, the biggest hokey pokey? And it's still a big deal. What about these fun? Mike Halas, our columnist, wrote a wonderful column today in today's paper, and mentioned that he's never seen a coach laugh as much as Hayden did, and maybe Hayden liked having fun too. Do you guys have some good stories like that?
Well, the last time I saw Hayden, a couple years ago, it was during Fry Fest, and he was attending the game at Kinnick Stadium. And Don Doxey, former Gazette sports writer and longtime sports editor of the Quad City Times, so Doxey and I are there waiting for the elevator, and here comes Hayden in, and he walks right up to us, and he looked at Don, who maybe has put on a few pounds, and looked at me, and I'm not quite in my playing weight either, and he says, Jimmy, Donnie, it's good to see you guys so prosperous. And And he didn't mean prosperous in a monetary way. And he didn't know we were going to be there. And he's probably used the line 1,000 times. He had a repertoire.
He did.
But he was a classic, no doubt.
Yeah, he always, every time you'd call him up, the few times I talked to him on the phone and stuff, he kind of had the same lines. He had a set of lines he always liked to use.
Well, yeah, he had his favorite stories that he'd repeat over and over and over again, and no matter how many times he'd tell them. I remember at an iClub breakfast before a home game, and the gentleman's name is going to escape me, but he was the MC, and he did a tremendous Hayden Fry imitation. And he got up there, he was introducing Hayden, but he was trying to have some fun with Hayden, and he referred to Ronnie Harmon and all those fumbles in the Rose Bowl, and he hit a couple other sore spots. And at first the audience was chuckling along. Boyle, what was Boyle's first?
Tim Boyle.
Yeah. At first the audience was chuckling along, and then when they saw Hayden sitting there, stone-faced, the audience got quieter and quieter and quieter, and towards the end there was not a peep in there, and you could see Boyle knew he had treaded too far, and then he introduced Hayden, but yeah, there was never any doubt who the boss was when Hayden Fry was in the room. And one of the things about iClubs, and I have great admiration for Tom Davis. He did a phenomenal job. He treated me spectacularly well. He let me come to practices and other stuff. But if Tom Davis and Hayden Fry were at the same iClub banquet during the summer, which they were occasionally, not always, they'd split them up. Tom Davis could walk in a room and people would, they'd be, "Hey, Tom, how you doing?" I mean, he had a #1 team, almost, made the Final Four. Very polite. But when Hayden Fry walked in the room, people just flocked to him. And he'd talk to everybody. He'd sign any autograph. He'd stay long after the banquet was over. He was never in a rush, to get out of there, to get home. And he just had that magnetic personality that people embraced.
In terms of his personality, and you recall this, Jim, that it was almost predictable if they're going to face a very difficult team, say Michigan when it was 1 versus 2 week, he'd be jovial, be cracking jokes, be upbeat. But they were facing Northwestern when Northwestern was putrid, back in the day. Was serious business. He didn't say a whole lot, didn't do a whole lot, and probably by design more than anything else. But I'll always remember that about him too. The tough games, he was in the best mood.
Yeah. I think he did a lot of things by design. I think there was. Yeah. I don't think there was a. I mean. Yeah. He had his quips, he had his famous one-liners, or however you want to phrases. But I think a lot of what you said, I think a lot of it was by design.
And Barry Alvarez was on the Big Ten Network last night as well, and he said something interesting, that you saw the public Hayden, but you didn't see always the private Hayden and his attention to detail for his football team. How we're going to dress, the swarm, how we're going to come out of the locker room, how we're going to go back in. The types of uniforms, the Pittsburgh Steelers type uniforms that we're going to have, how they came up with the American Needs Farmers, which was so phenomenally successful and brought attention onto the farmers. And Alvarez or Long, one of them said that Hayden told everybody, if you're going to be successful in Iowa, first you have to win over the farmers. If you can win the farmers, you'll get the rest of the population. And so he was, on the outside, you saw him during the games with the sunglasses on. Even at night, he was wearing the sunglasses, and all that. But he was very shrewd behind the scenes, shrewd in who he hired, what he saw in these people, and what he demanded of them. I mean, there's countless stories, Mark would know better, from the early years of a guy like, Snyder or Brazier, sleeping in his office, working till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, getting 3 or 4 hours of shut eye and being back at it. And so he hired the right guys. He demanded loyalty, and they gave it.
And they were friends. I remember more than once going down to the facility, and off in the distance I see Dan McCarney and Barry Alvarez getting in a run, and after the games, they were really tight friends, and you don't see that on staffs very often.
Yeah. One of the things that can be a little sensitive, Hayden was not always politically correct.
A lot of things weren't politically correct back in his day, but yes, back in his heyday.
One of the more obvious and famous, and everybody knew it, Phil Hattie was the assistant SID at the time, then became SID, and I guess Hattie's ancestry goes to the Middle East somewhere, I'm not quite sure what country. And Hayden at press conferences where the camera's rolling would say, "Hey, Phil, where'd you park your camel today?" And, you shouldn't. It's not right. And there was another one, and I can't remember if Mary Sue Coleman had just become president or another female had become president. And somebody asked Hayden at a press conference, how do you feel about, let's say it was Mary Sue being the president? And he said, "I'm just glad she's not one of them." And at the time, the University of Iowa came to trial a couple years ago, with some lesbians on staff, and Hayden was not pro-lesbian, and he was glad that the female president was not one of them. And I remember him saying it wasn't during the press conference itself, it was right after when we were talking. Randy Peterson was covering the Hawkeyes for the Register, and I was there, a bunch of others. And when Hayden said that, Randy and I made eye contact, and we just shook our heads. And then when Randy and I talked later, this was after the little dumpling.
Yeah, because Little Dumpling, he got some flack for that too.
Yeah, the football players would find a little dumpling to do their laundry or whatever it was. And I don't know if I did the right thing or if Randy did the right thing, but Randy and I talked about it and we said, let's not go there.
Yeah.
We're just going to turn the whole state upside down with a comment like that. Maybe that was not the most responsible thing to do journalistically, but just didn't seem the right thing to do.
Right.
So.
Well, guys, I really appreciate you taking time out of your days to come in and do this. This has been a lot of fun. We got a lot of good stories. I got to tell the one I heard this morning. I was talking to Lou Montgomery, played I think 91 Rose Bowl, and I was at my workout class, and we did a moment of silence. He wanted to do a moment of silence because he's still Hawk true and true. And but I asked him, I said, "What is your favorite Hayden Fry story?" He said the 91 Rose Bowl. He said, we were sitting at the head table. We had the captains and the coaches. And the waiter came up and asked Hayden, said, "Hey, can I tell you a joke?" And Hayden said, "Sure." And the waiter said, "Do you know the difference between Iowa football and Cheerios?" And Hayden goes, "No." And he goes, "Cheerios belongs in a bowl. Iowa football doesn't." And now this is Lou's story. So he says, without a beat, Hayden goes, "We know the difference between a football coach and a golf pro?" And the kid goes, "No." He goes, "Golf pros give tips. Football coaches don't." So, and I related to that story to Bill Happel, and that's when Bill said, you never know if it's a story or if it's true or it's a story, but when it comes from Hayden. So, God bless him. Thank you guys for being here. He was an icon. He really was. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Not just a football coach. He was an icon here, and apparently there's a tribute going on right now at his statue. So down in Coralville. So
yeah, that statue. Pick up the statue and take it over to Kinnick Stadium, will you? I don't think Niall Kinnick would mind having Hayden as a partner. They could swap some good stories. It's a great statue, but to have it on Hayden Fry Way, I understand why they did it. Move it to the stadium. He's in line with those Herky statues down Hayden Fry Way. Put Hayden at Kinnick where he belongs.
Well, there's a movement, too, to name the field after Hayden. I don't know if I'd go that far, but I think Jim makes a good point.
Yeah. Well, there you go. You got something to work on now. Again, I'm J.R. Ogden from the Gazette. Mark Dukes works at KGYM. You can catch his radio show. Jim at KMRY. You can catch his radio show in the afternoons. Thank you guys so much for being here, and thank you for watching us.